Every year, Carnival would come and transform our city into a kaleidoscope of colors, music, and chaos. Streets would overflow with revelers, and the rhythmic beat of samba would reverberate through the night. For many, it was the highlight of the year. For me, it was a time to make extra cash. I was 24 that year, taking odd jobs to pay for college. My friend Diego, who seemed to have an uncanny knack for finding opportunities, convinced me to join him as a street vendor during the festivities. We'd sell beers, water bottles, and snacks from a cart he'd borrowed from his cousin. He assured me it would be easy money. By the third night of Carnival, we'd settled into a routine. We set up near Praça de Sé, one of the busiest squares in São Paulo. It was a prime spot, close enough to catch the main crowds but far enough from the police patrolling the official parade routes. Diego had a way with people, joking and flirting his way into selling twice as much as I could. I didn't mind. My job was to keep the inventory stocked and handle the cash. That night, the city was alive with energy. Thousands of people in costumes danced through the streets, their faces painted in bright colors, their laughter blending with the pounding drums. I remember thinking how the sheer density of the crowd made it feel like the city was pulsating, like a living organism. Around midnight, Diego nudged me and pointed to a narrow alley that cut between two colonial-era buildings. It was quieter there, and a few people were lingering in small groups. He suggested we push the cart closer to them, reasoning that less competition might mean more sales. I hesitated but eventually agreed. The square was so crowded that moving even a few meters was a struggle, but we managed. At first, the new spot seemed perfect. People trickled into the alley, grateful for a break from the crush of the main streets. Sales picked up, and Diego's charm worked its magic. But as the hours wore on, the crowd around us started to change. The festive atmosphere gave way to something darker. The groups lingering in the shadows weren't dancing or laughing. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces obscured by masks that felt less like celebration and more like concealment. Diego didn't seem to notice. He was busy haggling with a man who wanted to buy an entire case of beer. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I scanned the alley, trying to pinpoint the source of my unease. That's when I noticed a woman standing at the far end of the alley, partially hidden by a doorway. She wasn't wearing a mask, but her face was pale, almost ghostly under the flickering streetlight. Her eyes were fixed on us. I nudged Diego and whispered about the woman. He glanced over, shrugged, and told me not to worry. "She's probably just drunk," he said, but there was an edge to his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The woman didn't move. She just stood there watching. Minutes passed, then an hour. The crowd thinned, but she remained. Occasionally, she'd disappear into the shadows, only to reappear moments later in the same spot. I told Diego we should move back to the square, but he brushed me off, saying we'd lose our prime spot. Around 2 a.m., the alley grew eerily quiet. Most of the revelers had moved on to other parts of the city. Only a handful of people remained, and they seemed more interested in minding their own business than in buying anything from us. The woman at the far end of the alley was still there. Diego suggested we pack up for the night. As we loaded the remaining stock onto the cart, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I turned to look at the woman, but she was gone. For a moment, relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I turned back toward the cart, she was standing just a few meters away. I froze. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, bore into mine. She said nothing, her lips slightly parted as if she was about to speak but couldn't find the words. Diego noticed my reaction and turned to see what had startled me. His usual bravado faltered. He cleared his throat and asked the woman if she needed anything. She didn't respond. Diego nudged me and whispered that we should leave. I didn't argue. We started to push the cart toward the main street, but the woman stepped into our path. Diego tried to sidestep her, but she moved to block him. Her movements were quick, almost too quick. He asked her again, more firmly this time, what she wanted. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she needed help. Her words were disjointed, as if she were struggling to piece them together. She mentioned something about losing her friends and being followed. Diego shot me a look that said he didn't believe her. I suggested we call the police, but she shook her head violently. She said she couldn't trust them, that they wouldn't understand. Diego, clearly unnerved, muttered that we didn't have time for this and tried to push past her. That's when she grabbed his arm. Her grip was like a vice. Diego yelped and tried to pull away, but she held on, her eyes locking onto his. She repeated that she needed help, her voice growing louder, more desperate. I told her we couldn't help, that we needed to leave. She ignored me. Diego managed to wrench his arm free, and we both backed away, leaving the cart behind. The woman didn't follow. She just stood there watching as we retreated. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes never left us. When we reached the main street, we didn't stop running until we were several blocks away. The noise of the carnival crowd was a welcome relief, drowning out the sound of our labored breathing. Diego cursed under his breath, saying we'd just lost a night's worth of work because of some crazy woman. I didn't respond. My mind was racing, replaying the events in the alley. We never saw the woman again. The next morning, Diego went back to retrieve the cart, but it was gone. He joked that someone had probably stolen it, but I could tell he wasn't as nonchalant as he pretended to be. For the rest of Carnival, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something far worse than a lost cart. Brazilian Carnival is chaos, beautiful and overwhelming. It's an eruption of color and sound, a tidal wave of joy that sweeps up anyone in its path. But not everyone dances in the open. Some of us, the ones behind the curtains, the ones who make the spectacle possible, experience it differently. We see the machinery behind the magic, and sometimes we see the cracks. I was a costume designer for one of the smaller samba schools in Rio de Janeiro. While the big names, like Mangueira or Beija-Flor, dominated the Sambadrome, schools like ours worked tirelessly for a sliver of the spotlight. That year, we were debuting a theme centered around the folklore of the Amazon. Our dancers would be wrapped in green and gold, shimmering under the stadium lights like creatures born of the forest. The final week before Carnival was always the hardest. Endless nights of sewing, gluing, adjusting. The workshop buzzed with the frenetic energy of last-minute changes. Fabric scraps littered the floor, and the air smelled of paint and adhesive. But by the time the parade approached, the chaos would coalesce into something extraordinary. It was during one of those long nights that I first noticed the boy. I was bent over a headdress, carefully attaching emerald sequins, when I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. Turning, I saw him standing in the doorway of the workshop. He couldn't have been older than 10, dressed in a faded red shirt and shorts too big for his thin frame. His eyes were wide, curious, but he didn't say a word. "Are you lost?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle. Kids sometimes wandered in from the nearby favelas, drawn by the lights and the music. He shook his head, then pointed to the headdress in my hands. His lips moved, but his voice was drowned out by the blaring samba music from the rehearsal next door. I set the headdress down and approached him, but before I could get close, he darted away, disappearing into the maze of costumes and props. I mentioned the boy to a few colleagues, but no one else had seen him. They laughed it off, saying I was just tired. Maybe they were right. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford that week. The next night, as I worked late again, the boy returned. This time, he stayed longer, lingering near the racks of costumes. When I asked his name, he didn't respond. He only watched, his gaze flicking between me and the costumes. I thought about calling security, but something in his demeanor stopped me. He didn't seem like a threat, just out of place. By the third night, I'd grown used to his presence. He'd appear around midnight, quietly observing as I worked. Occasionally, I'd try to engage him in conversation, but he never spoke. He'd only point at the costumes, his expression unreadable. I started to wonder if he was one of the local kids hoping to join the samba school someday. Maybe he dreamed of dancing in the parade, wearing one of the dazzling creations we poured our souls into. It wasn't until the night before the parade that things began to feel wrong. I was alone in the workshop, triple-checking the final costumes. The boy appeared as usual, but this time he seemed agitated. He paced back and forth, his small hands clenching and unclenching. When I asked him what was wrong, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said I needed to check the float. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. He repeated himself more urgently this time. "Check the float." I'd been so absorbed in the costumes that I hadn't thought much about the floats. That wasn't my responsibility. Another team handled them. But the boy's insistence unsettled me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the storage yard where the floats were kept. The yard was a sprawling, dimly lit space filled with the skeletal frames of floats in various stages of completion. Ours was tucked in the back, a towering structure meant to resemble a giant ceiba tree. Its branches stretched toward the sky, adorned with papier-mâché animals and fake foliage. As I approached, my flashlight flickered. Typical. The batteries were on their last legs. Still, I managed to find a ladder and climb up to inspect the float. Everything seemed fine at first. The decorations were secure, the mechanics in place. But then, near the base of the tree, I noticed something odd. A section of the platform was splintered, as if someone had taken a hammer to it. Jagged edges stuck out dangerously, and below the platform, I found a coil of frayed electrical wiring. It looked as if it had been deliberately tampered with. My stomach churned. If this had gone unnoticed, it could have caused a serious accident during the parade. I reported the damage to the team leader, who promised to handle it. He seemed annoyed that I'd gone poking around in his department, but I didn't care. The thought of dancers, some of them children, standing on a faulty platform made my skin crawl. When I returned to the workshop, the boy was gone. I didn't see him again after that night. The parade went off without a hitch. Our samba school dazzled the crowd, our costumes shimmering under the floodlights. The float rolled smoothly down the avenue, its towering tree a highlight of the performance. By all accounts, it was a success. But I couldn't shake the memory of the boy. Who was he? How had he known about the damage to the float? I asked around, describing him to anyone who would listen, but no one could identify him. Some of my colleagues teased me, saying I'd imagined the whole thing. Others suggested he was just a street kid who'd gotten lucky with a guess. Weeks passed and life returned to normal. The workshop was quiet again, the chaos of Carnival replaced by the monotony of off-season repairs. I tried to put the incident out of my mind, but one day, while organizing fabric samples, I found something that stopped me cold. Tucked between two bolts of fabric was a small, crumpled photograph. It was old, the edges yellowed with age. The image showed a group of children standing in front of a samba float, their faces lit with excitement. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized the boy in the faded red shirt. He stood in the front row, his wide eyes staring directly at the camera. I turned the photo over, searching for clues. On the back, someone had scrawled a date, 1987. My chest tightened. That was decades before I joined the school. I showed the photo to one of the older members of the team, hoping he might remember something. His face paled when he saw it. He explained that in 1987, a tragic accident had occurred during Carnival. One of the floats had collapsed during the parade, killing several children who had been riding on it. The boy in the photo was one of the victims. I didn't know what to think. The rational part of me clung to the possibility that it was a coincidence, that the boy I'd seen was just a lookalike. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that he'd been trying to warn me. If you've never been to the Brazilian Carnival, it's impossible to understand its scale. It's not just an event. It's an eruption of energy that consumes the city. The streets turn into rivers of people, every square inch vibrating with music, color, and life. It's overwhelming, intoxicating, and, at times, disorienting. I wasn't there to celebrate. My job was to document the festival for a travel magazine. I was an outsider, parachuted in with a camera and a notebook, tasked with capturing the essence of the carnival for readers thousands of miles away. At first, I was thrilled. This was the kind of assignment I dreamed about when I became a journalist. But by the time I left, I knew I'd never return. The first few days were exhilarating. I threw myself into the chaos, chasing parades and bloco parties, weaving through costume dancers, and snapping photos of everything and everyone. There was a wildness to it all, a sense that anything could happen. For a while, I got lost in the rhythm, forgetting that I was supposed to be an observer. It wasn't until the third night that I started to feel uneasy. I was walking through Lapa, a neighborhood famous for its nightlife, when I noticed a figure standing under one of the arches of the aqueduct. He was wearing a golden mask that covered his entire face, the kind you'd see at a Venetian masquerade. It wasn't unusual. Masks were everywhere during Carnival. But there was something unsettling about the way he stood perfectly still, watching the crowd pass by. I paused to take a photo, framing him against the pale curve of the arch. When I lowered the camera, he was gone. I scanned the crowd, but there was no sign of him. Shaking off the odd encounter, I moved on, chalking it up to exhaustion. The days were long, and sleep was a luxury I hadn't been able to afford. The next night, I saw him again. This time, I was in Santa Teresa, a hilltop neighborhood with narrow, winding streets. The party here was smaller, more intimate. Strings of fairy lights hung between the buildings, casting a warm glow over the revelers. I was photographing a group of musicians when I caught sight of the golden mask in the corner of my frame. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, motionless, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening. I turned to look, but he was already gone. The musicians asked me what was wrong, and I told them it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been watching me. By the fifth night, I was on edge. I kept seeing the mask in my peripheral vision, a flash of gold in the crowd, a glint in the distance. Every time I looked, he'd vanish. I started to wonder if I was imagining him, if the fatigue and sensory overload were playing tricks on my mind. But then something happened that I couldn't explain. I was in the Sambadrome, the massive arena where the samba schools compete. The energy was electric, the crowd roaring as the floats paraded down the runway. I was photographing one of the performers, a dancer in an elaborate feathered costume, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see a fellow journalist or maybe a security guard. Instead, I found myself face to face with the golden mask. Up close, it was even more unnerving. The mask was intricately detailed, its surface etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shimmer in the light. The eyes behind it were dark, unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, his hand still resting on my shoulder. I stumbled back and he let go. By the time I regained my balance, he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mask. I tried to convince myself that it was just a costume, that the man behind it was no different from the thousands of others celebrating Carnival. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something I didn't want to understand. The final night of Carnival, I decided to confront him. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't leave without finding out who he was. I spent hours wandering the streets, searching for the golden mask. The city felt different that night, its usual vibrancy muted. The music seemed distant, the laughter hollow. Even the crowds felt thinner, as if the energy of the festival was winding down. It was almost midnight when I spotted him. He was standing in a narrow alley near Cinelandia, the glow of a street lamp reflecting off his mask. My heart pounded as I approached, camera in hand. When I was a few feet away, I called out to him, asking who he was and why he'd been following me. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed to the camera. I hesitated, then lifted it to take a photo. As I pressed the shutter, the street lamp flickered and went out, plunging the alley into darkness. For a moment, I froze, disoriented. When the light came back on, he was gone. I looked at the camera, hoping the photo would give me some answers. But when I checked the screen, the image was black. Not underexposed or blurry, completely black, as if the photo hadn't been taken at all.